Welcome everyone to the August seminar in the D'Annunzio Institute of Philosophy's 2021 seminar series featuring Dr. Carolina Sartorio. My name is Nevin Kleimenhage. I'm a senior research fellow here at D'Annunzio and the organizer of our seminar series. Australian Catholic University established the D'Annunzio Institute in April 2019 to build a world-leading research center in analytic philosophy. Our name comes from the Greek word dianoia, which means thought, and is used by Plato in the Republic to denote the reflective and discursive reasoning that leads from mere opinion, doxa, to knowledge or understanding, nous. We are currently accepting applications from prospective master's and PhD students with a deadline of October 17th. And I'll drop the link for more information into the chat if you are interested or know of anyone who may be interested in our programs. This year, we launched our online seminar series in philosophy, showcasing research by leading philosophers from around the world. Our next seminar will be on September 30th, that's September 29th in the US and North America, featuring Jeff McMahon giving our inaugural annual seminar in social and political philosophy. We hope you will be able to join us for that seminar as well. A few other notes before we begin. This event is being recorded, and after the seminar, it will be put on our website. Dr. Sartorio's talk will go for about 45 minutes, and then we will have about an hour for Q&A. If you have a question that you would like to ask during the Q&A, please message me directly, and I will add you to the queue. Finally, it is our custom at Australian Catholic University to begin with an acknowledgement of country. We commence our meeting by acknowledging the First Peoples and the traditional custodians of the country where D'Annunzio is located, the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. We respectfully acknowledge their elders, past and present, and remember that they have passed on their wisdom to us in various ways. Let us hold this in trust as we work together and serve our communities. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Carolina Sartorio is professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona. Dr. Sartorio works at the intersection of metaphysics, the philosophy of action, and moral theory, exploring such issues as causation, agency, free will, and moral responsibility. Her most recent book is a co-authored debate book with Robert Kane, entitled Do We Have Free Will? A Debate. Her talk for us today is entitled Causalism. All right, over to you, Carolina.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Do you want to put the handout in the chat now?
Yeah, and I'll attach the handout in the chat so everyone can access that on their own.
Okay, so everybody can see the handout. All right. So the main purpose of this talk is to advocate for a causalist view of agency that is broader than the standard causalist view of agency, which is the leading view of action nowadays. So it's broader in the sense that it's supposed to also cover free action. And this is partly based on earlier work of mine, and some further reflections that comments by my critics prompted me to have, and some new thoughts that I'm hoping to develop into a new book. So it's kind of it defends this view that I call big picture causalism, but it's a big picture type of talk in that it focuses on mainly general features of the view without paying too much attention to the details. But if you need more details, we can talk about them during the Q&A. So the main thesis of big picture causalism is that what makes a behavior an action or a free action is it's having a certain causal history. So there's certain causal facts, concerning the causal explanation or causal history of the behavior that make it the case that the behavior is an action, or that make it the case that the behavior is a free action. And I think that one main way to put this idea is in terms of full grounds. So basically what this means is that the relevant causal facts are full grounds of either the action facts or the free action facts. So this is obviously, as you can see, an extension of the leading conception of action, because it's also supposed to cover free action. And it's important to note that the central claim that I just stated, according to which the relevant causal facts are full grounds, is compatible with the existence of further grounds, namely the grounds of those causal facts themselves. This is a pretty obvious point, I think, the fact that full grounds are compatible with further grounds, but it's something that was kind of resisted by my critics, and I was a bit surprised by the resistance. So I want to, first of all, explain in more detail why I think this is true, and then also explain what could go into those grounds, the grounds of the causal facts themselves. Causal, okay, there we go. It's just a function of the actual causal histories. And some people have taken that to mean that other things besides causal histories cannot play an explanatory role in free action. But I think that idea is just wrong, because there could be grounds of those causal facts themselves. So even some things like dispositions, dispositional concepts or powers could potentially play such a role. So that's what I call powers-enriched causalism. Okay, so now we're moving down to, this is the part where I explain both the main motivations for the big picture causalist view, and I give a very, very quick sketch of what that big picture causalist view might look like. So as for the motivations, well, when you think about causalism about action, these are some motivations that are typically mentioned, and I think they're spot on. And they're the main reason why causalism is the leading picture of action these days. So one thing you can say on behalf of causalism, this is something that people like Mealy have said, is that causalism can distinguish actions from mere behaviors, behaviors that are not actions. So for example, if I intend to move my arm and then some Martians take over and they don't let my intention result in the behavior that they cause the behavior themselves, the raising of my arm or the moving of my arm is not an action, it's a mere behavior. Why? Because according to causalism, there isn't the relevant causal connection between the intention and the behavior. Also, people like Davidson in particular have pointed out that causalism can account for the special role played in action by the reasons for which we act, as compared with potential reasons that we might have to act. Where that set of reasons that we might have to act in the relevant ways is potentially broader than the reasons for which we act. So I might have different reasons for eating broccoli. So maybe I find it tasty, but I also think it's healthy. And on a particular occasion, I might be motivated by one set of reasons, but not by the other. So what makes it an action, or what makes it an action done for reasons, is the particular reason or set of reasons that move me to act. And causalists would understand that in causal terms, the reasons that caused my behavior. So moreover, not only is causalism a way of accounting for these distinctions, but it seems to be the most natural way to do that. So very quickly, those are some main motivations for being a causalist about action. One thing that is sometimes, I think, overlooked is that there are some motivations for the causalist view of free action that partially overlap with the motivations for causalism about action. So when you think about that second motivation, the case of action, you see that something like that plays a similar role for free action. If you look at the classical Frankfurt paper, where he argues against the principle of alternative possibilities, he argues that alternative possibilities are not required for the freedom relevant for moral responsibility. My interpretation of that reasoning is that that reasoning suggests that only causal histories, actual causal histories, are relevant to free action. And one way to see that is in terms of the distinction between reasons that you might have to act versus the reasons that in fact move you to act. So Frankfurt has an example involving a coercive threat. Somebody launches a coercive threat and you're kind of impressed by the threat, but at the end of the day, you're not moved by the threat and you're moved by your own reasons to act. And he argues that in that type of case, you arguably act freely. You act freely because you were not moved by the threat, which might be a reason that you had to act, but you were in fact moved by your own reasons to act. Those are the reasons for which you acted. So that's one way to interpret what's going on. And what's interesting about free action is that that idea can be generalized to the role played in the theory by the distinction between actual causes and other merely potential causes of the behavior. So this is the main point that is sometimes spelled out in connection with Frankfurt's reasoning. Frankfurt's reasoning seems to suggest that only the actual explanations of behavior matter to our free will. And he gave these famous examples involving sneaky neuroscientists who are in the background, monitoring your behavior, making sure that you make a certain decision. If you were not to make it on your own, then the neuroscientists would intervene and would force you to make that same choice. But you didn't have to intervene because you, in fact, made it on your own, so you acted for your own reasons. So causalism would say, well, intuitively, what matters is the actual causes, the fact that you did it for your own reasons. And that's why Frankfurt thought the agent is free and responsible in this case. So that distinction between the actual causes and merely potential causes is something that causalism can easily account for. And again, this is a generalization, I think, of the previous idea about reasons that you might have to act versus reasons for which you in fact act. So again, I think causalism is the most natural way to capture these distinctions. So again, very quickly, those are the main motivations that you might have to be a causalist across the board concerning agency and free agency. Another thing I want to say very quickly, we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want, is one thing that this suggests to me is that the causalist view, the big picture causalist view, should be conceived as, in a sense, the default view of free agency, which kind of runs against what people tend to think. People tend to think the principle of alternative possibilities is so intuitive that Frankfurt's reasoning tends to go against that principle and put some pressure. However, the burden of proof is on Frankfurt to show that alternative possibilities don't matter. But another way to look at this is, well, we all knew that actual causes mattered to our capacity to perform actions and to our capacity to perform free actions, right? Obviously, the actual causes, the actual explanations of your behavior matter to whether you act and whether you act freely. So you should give us reasons for thinking that other things matter too. Unless we have good reason to believe that, if we can explain everything that alternative possibilities theories can explain by appeal to alternative possibilities, if we can explain that in purely causal terms, then that's a reason to stick with the big picture causalist view. And the fact that the view can be so easily extended from action to free action is perhaps yet another motivation for thinking that this should be seen as the default view of free agency. At any rate, that's my thought. Now, let me quickly explain how you can, in fact, build a big picture causalism by extending the causalist view from action to free action. And here I'm relying on that earlier work of mine in the book Causation and Free Will. So this is going to be an oversimplification of the view of free action that I present there. I don't really talk about action in that book, I just talk about free action. So the main idea is that the requirements for free action simply build on the earlier, more basic requirements. Oh, it should say for action there. The requirements for free action build on the requirements for action. That's a typo. The thought is that there's a continuum of causal complexity, in the sense that causes get more and more complex as you move from first mere behaviors that are not actions, to actions, because there you have to add something like reasons or intentions playing a certain role, and then to free actions. So you need more causes, or you need more complex or more sophisticated kinds of causes in each case. So how do you get to free action? Well, my suggestion is that you do that by building a theory of reason's sensitivity that suggests that the freedom of an agent is a function of their sensitivity to reasons, and that's something that can be basically encapsulated in the causal history of the behavior itself, right? So the causal history itself, the actual causes, show whether the agent is suitably sensitive to reasons, actually sensitive to reasons, or not. How do you do that? How can you get that just from actual causes? The main idea is that in addition to actual reasons for action, there's absences of reasons to refrain from acting, and that free action is action that is sensitive to, in addition to perhaps the actual reasons to act, a suitable range of those absences of reasons to refrain from acting. The best way to see that, I think, is with an example. Hopefully this will help. So if you start out with somebody who is a compulsive, right? So somebody who compulsively washes their hands, or my example here is somebody who is a compulsive cookie eater. I call that the cookie monster. The thought is that when somebody acts compulsively, thus not freely, the actual causes of their behavior are kind of simple, right? So basically they act on impulses, they act on desires and stuff like that. But when somebody acts freely, when somebody eats a cookie freely, there's a lot more going on in the actual causes of the behavior, or the actual explanation of the behavior. And in particular, that is something that reflects whether the agent is reason sensitive in the relevant way. So the rough idea is the compulsive, the cookie monster, would eat the cookie no matter what, or would be disposed to eat the cookie no matter what. So he would eat the cookie even if he's already eaten way too many cookies and he has reasons to believe that another cookie will give him a stomachache. He would eat the cookie even if it was the last cookie on the plate, right? We've all been told you should not eat the last cookie on the plate. He would eat the cookie even if he knew that others want that cookie, and so on and so forth. Whereas free agents don't. Free agents are typically sensitive at least to a range of considerations of this kind. So when you're in a situation where you don't believe that the cookie will give you a stomachache, and it's not the last cookie on the plate, and it's not the case that others want the cookie, you're still sensitive, if you act freely, you're still sensitive to the absence of those features, right? So the causal history of your behavior is much more complex in the sense that it contains all these absences of reasons to refrain. And the causal history of the Cookie Monster's behavior does not. It's a much simpler, more straightforward type of causal history. Okay, so that was super, super rough. But one way to see this might help later on, is to imagine that we have these sort of prudential or moral sensors that sometimes get activated, but sometimes they're not activated. So we have this sensor that basically allows us to refrain from eating the cookie when it's the last cookie on the plate or when others would want the cookie, right? So for free agents, the possession of those sensors and their inactivity explains why we behave in the way we behave, even when those features are not actual, right? So when it's not the last cookie on the plate, the inactivity of the sensor is still part of what explains why you take the cookie, because it's not the last cookie on the plate. Okay. So that's, again, very rough sketch of the motivation for the view and the view. Now I'm going to do a very rough sketch of how the basic big picture causalist view could be enriched by appeal to powers. And the thought here, perhaps at first surprisingly, or rather surprisingly, is that the story is going to be quite different for action and free action. Although a big picture causalist view is committed to the idea that only causal histories are grounds, right, or full grounds of action and free action. Nothing else matters, in a sense. The grounds of the relevant causal facts could be quite different in each case, for action or for free action. So there could be different kinds of powers involved. And also what I'm going to suggest is that the most plausible version of this view is one according to which manifested powers play a role for action and unmanifested powers play a role for free action. So it's not just that there are different powers involved, but also some of them are manifested and some of them are unmanifested. And the result for free action might seem a little odd because, again, a causalist view is committed to the idea that only actual causes are relevant. But if the grounds for those actual causes involves not actually manifested powers, you get the relevance of some non-actual things being compatible with the main causalist view. But I think that's perfectly okay. And I think that's, in fact, quite plausible. Okay, so for action, here, this part is not like completely original on its own, but my main contribution is simply to explain how this stuff can be made consistent with a big picture causalist view. And I'm not going to be defending powers-enriched causalism. I'm just interested in exploring the view, and also maybe suggesting that it has at least some initial plausibility. So for action, I think the most plausible suggestion is to say that manifested powers play a role in grounding the relevant causal facts. And the main motivation for saying something like that, it seems to me, is that saying something like that can potentially help with the famous problem of causal deviance that people have pointed out for causalist views of action. So take this one case to illustrate. Imagine that I'm about to take my picture, to get my picture taken by somebody else, and they tell me to stand still. And I'm rebellious, so I form the intention to move, to ruin the picture. Now, once I form that intention, the fact that I'm being rebellious is kind of unnerves me. And my being unnerved in that way is what results in my moving at the relevant time. But my movement is completely involuntary. So the intention to move, in fact, causes me to move, but in a deviant kind of way. Right? So this is a case where the intention brings about the behavior, but it's not an action, it's a mere behavior. Why? Because intuitively it's not the right kind of causal connection. Now, of course, the next question is, but when are causal histories of the right kind? And here's, I think, where powers might help. So you might want to say, the causal history is of the right kind when that causal history involves the manifestation of a certain kind of power, something like a disposition, perhaps. I don't have in mind anything spooky, right? So some natural power, some disposition, perhaps an ability. In this case, something like the disposition to move upon intending to move. So arguably, this is a case where, although I had such a disposition, I didn't end up manifesting that disposition, right? That disposition is not what was being manifested and what resulted in my moving. And that explains why intuitively this is not an action. So this kind of enriched causalism that I'm calling manifested powers causalism, MP causalism, would suggest, and I'm trying to be as neutral as I possibly can here about the nature of powers themselves, but it would suggest roughly that the causal chain is not of the right kind in this case because it isn't grounded in an exercise or a manifestation of my ordinary power, the disposition to move my body. Or perhaps if powers, dispositions are themselves grounded in other things, and again, I want to remain neutral on that, or in facts that underlie the exercise of such a power. So for something to be an action, it has to, the causal history has to involve manifestation of powers in some sense. Either, I mean, if you think that powers are primitive or manifestations of powers are primitive, you can say the manifestation of the power has to ground the relevant causal history. Or if you think they're not primitive, it could be grounded in the grounds of the manifestation of the power itself. That's the rough idea. If you said something like that, I think this is an idea which again remains pretty vague and open-ended, but it ties very nicely with some proposals offered by philosophers of action that want to involve or appeal to dispositional concepts such as abilities or skills. So here I list some of them. Some references. Mealy and Moser has got this paper on intentional action that appeals to skills. Clark does too. Sosa in a quite different context. Hyman's another one. So this is an appeal to powers or power manifestations to try and shed some light on the causal deviance problem. Now, why is this progress, you might think, right? Well, so all I want to suggest here is something like this. At the very least, I think if this works, this shows that the problem of deviance concerning action simply reduces to a more commonplace deviance problem that arises for dispositions themselves, right? So if you think that's progress, then that's all I wanted to do in this part of the talk. And there is this general problem of concerning dispositions much more generally. So I'm giving a case here that I call deviant fragility that is supposed to illustrate that. So it's supposed to illustrate the fact that it's not enough for a disposition to be manifested, that the stimulus occur and that the manifestation occur as a result or as a causal result of the stimulus. Because sometimes the causal chain is deviant. And when the causal chain is deviant, intuitively, the disposition has not been manifested. So in deviant fragility, you have a vase that is fragile, and the vase is subjected to the relevant stimulus, say you dropped it, and it breaks, right? And the vase is fragile, right? So it has the disposition, but the claim is going to be that in breaking in these special circumstances, the vase did not manifest its natural disposition to break. So all you have to imagine is that there's some intervener, such as some evil demon that is quite eccentric. So what he is going to do is he's going to wait and see when people are about to drop vases, then he gets ready to intervene and he makes them break before they break on their own. And if it helps, you can imagine that he makes them break in a way that he could make anything in the world break. So it doesn't have to be a fragile object because he's a very powerful demon. So he magically makes the vase shatter. So intuitively, this vase has not manifested the natural disposition that it has to break in this case. But you have a causal connection between the stimulus and the manifestation. So that's the thought. The main thought is that, well, this happens for fragile vases, right? So maybe it's not such a big deal that it also happens for human actions. And perhaps there's a solution for the general deviance problem concerning dispositions. Or perhaps we don't have a theory to offer, and all we have is intuitions about specific cases. Either way, it seems to me that perhaps we will have made some progress in reducing one deviance problem to another. Okay, but again, all of this is compatible with the causalist view of action, of course. Powers play a role, but if they play a role, manifested powers play a role by grounding the relevant causal chains. Now, once we move to free action, I think the most plausible story, especially if you take something like my view that I described before, is one that appeals not to manifested powers. Yeah, I have a section of this chapter where I talk about how you can recreate the problem of deviance for free actions, and manifested powers are not going to help in that case. So it's all quite different once you move to free action. But an appeal to unmanifested powers is much more plausible. So here, remember what the view said was basically that in order for an action to be free, it has to be caused or explained in the right kind of way. There has to be, in addition to potential actual reasons that you have for acting, there has to be a suitable pattern of absences of reasons that causally explains your actions. So that's a claim about absent reasons. When we act freely, a pattern of such absences of reasons explains our actions. But there's also a parallel claim that you might make about powers, or about, in this case, inactive or unmanifested powers. When we act freely, we have certain powers that, for example, compulsive people don't have. The powers to respond to the absent reasons. We possess certain powers that remain inactive in the actual case, and that inactivity, or those powers, is relevant to the explanation of our actions. They explain why we act in the way we do. They explain why we didn't refrain. Whereas for compulsive people, they don't. So we have this claim about absent reasons, and we have this claim about inactive powers. So one possible suggestion is to say that what explains that correspondence that we see between the two claims is that one grounds the other, basically. That to say that those absences of reasons explain our behavior when they do is in virtue of the fact that we have those powers, the relevant powers. Or again, I want to be neutral about whether powers are grounded in other things. So they could be grounded in the grounds of those powers. So I'm going to give an example to illustrate all of this. But before we get there, the main view is this unmanifested power causalism idea, UP causalism, which says simply facts about freedom are fully grounded in facts about causal histories, and those facts themselves are grounded in facts about unexercised powers, or if those powers are grounded in other things, in the grounds of those powers. So in fact, you can have different views here depending on what view you have about powers. And I'm trying to be, again, very neutral on all of this. But here's some relevant ones. So here's the example. Imagine somebody who acts freely. So somebody who eats the cookie freely. So F3 here, the third claim is a claim that that act has the relevant causal history because it's a free act. What is the relevant causal history? It's basically that it's caused by the absences of reasons. But then distinguish these two other facts, F1 and F2. F2 is the claim that, or the fact that the agent has the relevant disposition, the disposition to respond to the absent reasons, because it's a free agent, has this disposition. And then there could be potentially a base for the disposition. So if you believe the disposition is grounded in other things, I think it's quite plausible to believe that the ground is something like this. It's the agent is internally constituted in the relevant kind of way. Perhaps this is all intrinsic to the agent, right? The internal constitution. So if you take a non-reductive view, according to which dispositions are not identical with their bases, but they're grounded in those bases, a non-reductive functionalist view that some people have defended, Pryor, Jackson, and Pettit, you get a grounding structure of this kind. Either F1 grounds F2, which in turn grounds F3. So the fact that the agent is constituted in a certain way grounds the fact that the agent has the relevant disposition, which grounds the fact that the absences of reasons bring about the behavior. Or perhaps it's F1 itself, the fact that it's doing all the grounding, right? The intrinsic base of the disposition, both grounds the disposition and the fact that the act has the right kind of causal history. Either way, you have F1 or F2 playing a role of some kind. And then, of course, if you're a reductivist and you believe dispositions are just identical with their basis, you have F1 is identical with F2, and that grounds F3. I guess I'm inclined to believe in the non-reductive view over the reductive view. So if that's right, the story is going to be slightly more complicated, but not a lot more complicated. Okay, so I am going to be able to finish this on time. Okay, so I want to mention these last 2 points on general versus specific abilities and the 2 insights about free action. So going back to the free will debate, remember that the causalist view, what I'm calling the causalist view of free action, was originally motivated by Frankfurt's reasoning. And Frankfurt's reasoning was, the main target of Frankfurt's reasoning was the principle of alternative possibilities, right? Which is sometimes conceived of as the traditional view or the classical view of freedom. The idea that free will requires the ability to do otherwise or alternative possibilities. So the enriched view that appeals to unmanifested powers is an interesting combination, right? Because it combines Frankfurt's own idea, or the idea motivated by Frankfurt's own reasoning, because he never defended the view that I defended, with the relevance of unmanifested powers. And moreover, these aren't just any kind of unmanifested powers, but in some sense, they're powers to do otherwise, right? So it's important to see what the difference really amounts to at the end of the day. And I think the difference is simply this. If this story makes sense, then there's some kind of general ability or general disposition to do otherwise that plays a role in a causalist view of free action. But it's not the kind of ability to do otherwise that people like Van and Wagen have in mind, because that's what's typically conceived of as a specific ability to do otherwise, as an ability to do otherwise that you have by virtue of both having the general ability to do otherwise and finding yourself in the right kind of circumstances where you can exercise that ability. But of course, this is not what's going on in this case, because according to the view that I defend, those reasons that would prompt the agent to refrain from acting are not in fact present, they're absent. So the agent doesn't have the opportunity to exercise the disposition. So at most, this is a general ability. It's not a specific ability. Hence, it doesn't entail a commitment to an alternative possibilities view of free action. Still, it's interesting that some kind of disposition to do otherwise plays an explanatory role according to the powers-enriched version of the causalist view. And then I guess an advantage or a payoff of this view is that that kind of view allows us to reconcile what I take to be 2 insights about free action, 2 ideas that seem highly plausible at first. So one of them is the one suggested by Frankfurt's reasoning, the idea that, well, all that matters is why you actually did what you did, not what would have happened if things had been different in some way. It's all a matter of actual explanations or actual causes. But to the extent that that is compatible with a role played by unexercised powers, we can say unexercised powers can still be relevant. The relevant kinds of unexercised powers can still be relevant to free action. And then the last point is simply to go back to the big picture causalist view. So if this is right and what you have playing a role in each case is quite different, because there are different kinds of powers, and it's also manifested powers in one case and unmanifested powers in the other case. I think that really shouldn't be that surprising. I mean, the absences of reasons play an explanatory role, if I'm right, only in the case of free action. And it's only when we think about the role played by absences of reasons that the idea of unexercised powers becomes plausible. So that's why I think we see that divergence between the causalist story for action and the causalist story for free action. In other words, you have a causalist view that is the same on the top, right? It's just a function of actual causes. Actual causes are full grounds of action and free action. But of course, different types of causes could be at play in each case. And in fact, I think that's true, that they are at play in each case. And those different kinds of causes call for different kinds of grounds. And those different kinds of grounds could be potentially powers of different kinds. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I'll stop sharing.
All right, thank you very much for that talk. Let's thank our speaker. Asked me to read the questions himself, or myself rather. So I'll do that in a minute. I might take them separately depending on the length of the queue. But first, Monica Sieber will ask our first question.
Hi, thanks for staying up late. I don't know how late it is for you, but thanks for staying up either way. Mine was more of a clarification about your Cookie Monster scenario. You talked about the Cookie Monster having a compulsion to act and therefore not being aware of, I guess you could say, external reasons to not act. So, you know, not being aware of the etiquette of eating the last cookie or something like that. And I just wanted to, you know, clarify, so is there a difference between someone who has the compulsion to act and is aware of those reasons, but the compulsion overrides those reasons? So maybe in this case, the Cookie Monster has the compulsion, they're aware of the etiquette of eating the last cookie, but their compulsion overrides that. And someone who has the impulse to eat the cookie and is not aware of the etiquette of eating the last cookie, and so they follow through on that impulse without taking those external reasons into account. So it's, you know, if there are these other reasons, there's the case where they're absent and so the person acts. There's the case where they are present but they have a compulsion or some other impetus that outweighs those reasons. And then there's the case where those reasons exist but they're unaware. I just wanted,
no, good question. Reason sensitivity theorists typically distinguish between the capacity to recognize reasons and the capacity to respond to reasons. So first you have to be able to recognize or be aware of the existence of a reason or the fact that you have a reason. And then you have to be able to respond to the reason. So it sounds like that's the kind of question that you had in mind. So what is needed for you to be in fact sensitive to reasons in the relevant way? Well, you need both, or you need responsiveness, which requires the capacity to recognize in the first place. So it has to be the case that you are in fact responding to those features of the circumstances. For that to be the case, you have to be, in some sense, not consciously at the moment, right? But it's not like you have to be thinking about etiquette rules or anything like that. but you have to have the capacity to recognize those kinds of reasons. So I think as far as the freedom of the cookie monster is concerned, they're equally unfree. If the reason they don't respond to the absence of reasons is that they don't even recognize, they don't have the capacity to be aware or anything like that, or they do, but their compulsion overrides the awareness. So they can recognize that they're not doing what they should be doing. They still do it, right? They recognize that they're not acting freely, I guess, but they're not acting freely either way. So I guess that happens with compulsions all the time. I mean, I don't know much about the empirical literature, but a compulsive hand washer might recognize that they shouldn't be washing their hands once more, that they've done enough, right? That they don't have a good reason to do it, and they still find themselves doing it. So if that's the case, they act unfreely. But they will also act unfreely if they can't even recognize the reason. Right?
Okay, yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
All right, I'm going to read out the first two of the questions in the chat here then. And just a reminder that if you have a question that you'd like to ask Dr. Sartorio, send me a message in the chat and I'll add you to the queue. Okay, so the first question is, does Carolina draw a distinction between reasons and causes? And then the second question is, what is the connection / relationship between reasons to act and Maupertuis's / Lagrange's principle of least action?
Okay, so let me answer the second one first. I have no idea because I don't know what those things are. If anybody knows, or maybe Tibor can write on the chat quickly what they have in mind. I mean, I might have heard of the principle, but I don't recognize it by that name.
Tibor can type in the chat to clarify. I think there's
thank you. Yeah.
A principle of least action along the lines of like nature or God always acts according to like in the most straightforward way, or the way that involves the least the least action overall. So I'm not sure if something along those lines is what he has in mind.
Yeah. Well, let's wait and see if he has something to add to that.
So the first question was then about.
Sure, I get it. Okay, the first one, yeah, the first one is easier.
Answer that one.
So when you act for a reason, that reason is a cause. So in that sense, I'm complete agreement with Davidson, right? And they claim that reasons are causes in that sense. But of course, causes are broader than just reasons. All kinds of things are causes. When I moved to the second motivation for free action, I said, well, this idea can be generalized to the potential significance of the distinction between actual causes and merely potential causes or backup causes or something like that. And so here you have something like a neuroscientist who's ready to intervene and force you to act. That's not a reason, right? That would be just a cause of your behavior. Let's see, I got the easiest thing happens first. So something like apply to action, that we always act on the basis of the simplest reasons or something like that. I don't see the motivation for believing in anything like that as applied to action, I guess. I mean, sometimes people act for the craziest reasons. But yeah, if you have more to say, feel free to write on the chat.
All right. So the next question is from Riza Hadisi.
Okay, I know. So I had a bit of a worry about the way you made the distinction between action and free action. Partly because maybe I think the confusion might be that I just don't get the category of action as this in between behavior. And I think I get behavior, I get free action. I think in between a bit confuses me. Maybe this is why. So I think every intention has this embedded conditional content that any intentional action, I intend to go to grocery, I intend to do that provided that somebody is not killing my child, provided that there's not an atomic bomb going off if I go and so on. So it seems like there's always this absence of reasons to refrain that I am at some level sensitive to for any level of intentional action. And I mean, the Cookie Monster thing, for instance, the complete compulsion just sounds like behavior to me, that this is just mere behavior. It's not my doing, it's just happening to me. Unless there is some sort, I mean, say the Cookie Monster might not be refraining from those reasons, but refraining from something else. Maybe if, you know, taking the cookie is gonna kill Elmo, it's not gonna do it. So yeah, something like that.
I'm sorry that I added that. I thought some humor might not hurt. Yes, so I'm sorry because I was oversimplifying, you know, in so many different ways. So the proposal, and I'm not alone in this, I mean, all reason sensitive theorists, reason sensitivity theorists appeal to something like this idea that what you need is not something like perfect reason sensitivity, and it's also not enough that you're sensitive to some absences of reasons, right? Especially if there are some very extreme ones, like Elmo is gonna get killed, right? Or the world is gonna come to an end, or something like that. So we wanna be able to offer a proposal that would work for free action in general. Maybe it's a degree notion. That's another thing that you can say, right? That you can be free, less free or more free. You can be free to different degrees. And perhaps for moral responsibility, you need some kind of threshold, or maybe responsibility itself is a degree notion. So perhaps the compulsive is free to some degree, but it's not enough for us to blame it for what he does, right? So that would be one idea. But I guess I'm not totally opposed to the idea of saying that if somebody acts completely automatically, so some machine, some robot or something that acts on the basis of something like intentions and pays no attention to absent reasons, they act. Right? So it sounds like you would disagree with that proposal, and it's not really essential to my view. But if all it takes to act is the relevant kind of mental state, where again, of course, there's a question about what is a mental state, bringing about a relevant behavior, you have the possibility of action in these cases, action that is not free. So yeah, you said you don't see the distinction between action and free action. Compulsive action was supposed to be, in this talk, the main example of that. Right? It is action because the compulsive is acting for reasons, and the compulsive is acting from intentions and so on, but it's not free action. So that's the thought. And I mean, yeah, it might not be fully clear where to draw the line, but I think there is a distinction there that we should respect. If you're not convinced, I guess you go straight from mere behaviors to free actions, and the other things would be mere behaviors. I mean, you could go that route, but I don't see a good motivation for going that route. Thanks for that question, but we can talk a lot more about that in our seminar later in the semester.
The next question is from Mylan Engel.
Thanks, Carolina, for an interesting talk. So first, a clarificatory question. Is your view that in order to be acting as opposed to merely behaving, you have to be acting for a reason, but to be acting freely, you have to be acting out of from an intention?
Oh, I was trying to be completely neutral on whether you need reasons or intentions can in fact do the work without reasons. I mentioned reasons at the beginning because that's how Davidson thinks about it. But more recently, some causalists have proposed you don't always act for reasons. What you need is an intention. Yeah, go ahead.
The reason I was asking is it seems to me that any plausible theory of action should have the result that non-human animals are capable of acting. And not just cetaceans and elephants and great apes. I think dogs and cats can act. I don't think they just behave. And so I'm wondering how your theory, I mean, would you attribute intentions to cats and dogs? I'm not clear quite what you mean by it. So
pretty sure,
what do you mean by an intention?
Well, I don't want to, I don't think I have to give a theory of what intentions are, but I find Millie's proposal on intentions kind of plausible, right? So you form an intention basically where you have made up your mind about what you're gonna do or try to do, right? It's a state where you're settling something, some question that you had. If you had a question, sometimes I think, again, I would agree with people like Millie when they say, you just find yourself forming intentions and you're not exactly sure why that happened, right? That you form the intention to raise your arm and you raised it. You form the intention. I think one of his examples is something like you see a bottle of beer in the store and just form the intention and go in and buy that beer. I'm not sure that's a really good example of something that people do kind of automatically. But other examples where you drive your car, if you always drive your car to work and you do it kind of automatically, and you just form the intention to turn left at a certain intersection. And it's not that you were thinking about it, yeah, it just happened. Maybe you even made a mistake because you were not supposed to go to work that day. Okay. But it's still an action.
That answers my question. I just had one last follow-up about, last comment about the bit at the very end between general versus specific. Mm-hmm. And if I'm understanding your view right, with causalism, given the actual antecedent conditions that precede my action, at that point, my action is causally necessitated. So it would be what I would call narrowly metaphysically necessary. That there's no possible world with all those antecedent conditions leading up to the point of action that I do anything other than say A. And so I'm comfortable with your account of action, but I'm puzzled by the sense in which it's free, if it's metaphysically necessitated given the antecedent causes.
I see. No, sorry, no, I didn't mean to give the impression that the causal connections are necessitating connections. So in fact, I'm writing a chapter where I try and explain how the causalists can work under the assumption of indeterminism. So what you need is, of course, indeterministic causal connections. So I think it would be a really big plus if a causalist could somehow make that work. And I think we can make it work. Maybe it takes a bit more work under the assumption of indeterminism, because you need the relevant kind of causal connections that are indeterministic, obtaining between not just reasons and behaviors, which I think is pretty easy to see how that might work, but between absences of reasons and behaviors.
So is it quantum indeterminate? Is that what you mean by indeterminate? Quantum indeterminate?
Any kind of indeterminism. So I guess the consensus nowadays is basically that causation can be indeterministic, right? We're not sure if there's any of that in our world, but it could potentially be indeterministic. So maybe there's some probabilistic laws involved when you form the intention to raise your hand, and that brought about the relevant movement in the right kind of way, and it happened by means of raising the probability, but not by necessitating that behavior. If something like that story works, then you have action without necessitating causes. And similarly for free action, hopefully. Although again, I think it's a little bit more tricky in that case. Thank you.
I had a question that relates to this, which I'm going to ask now. So I wondered about the relation between your view and indeterminism, if indeterminism was possible on your view. And in particular, I wondered about what you said a couple of times, that actual causes are full grounds, and if maybe you could elaborate on what you mean by that. So the first part of what I'm wondering about is are you using grounds in a general way, like as something like explanation? So that is what you mean, actual causes are full explanations? Because sometimes people will distinguish between causation and grounding, so that it would be like a category mistake to say that a cause is also a ground, or at least it'd be like a weird example where something was both a cause and a ground. So the idea there on the way some people use the terms, I think, is that grounds or metaphysical explanation, which is maybe it happens at the same time, and you're like going down levels, and causes go backwards in time. So these are two different kinds of things. So I wondered if
no, I didn't mean to say that causes are grounds. What I meant to say was that the relevant causal facts can themselves be grounded in other facts.
Okay.
And I did have in mind something like metaphysical explanation there.
Okay.
Right? Does that make sense? So the causal facts are just causal facts. They're not grounding facts.
Right. Okay.
I agree with that. But causal facts can be grounded. In fact, if causation is not a primitive notion, they will be grounded, right? And they can be grounded by different things. So people have suggested different things as far as the grounding of causation itself. As a general rule, you could have laws, you could have regularities, you could have counterfactuals, you could have all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. But what I was suggesting is that in this case, these specific causal facts could also be grounded in powers. Right. In different kinds of ways.
Okay.
Right. So that is metaphysical explanation.
Yeah.
So I guess the indeterminism question had to do with causation, not with grounding, right?
Right. Yeah. So that helps. So I think maybe I was just misunderstanding what you were, what you meant by that slogan. So then is your idea that actual causes are, so that what the causes of the action, the actual causes of the action fully explain the action? Would you say that? Because on some conceptions of full explanation, that would be determinate, but I think there might be others where it's something like, well, these are all there's nothing else that actually explains it. This is it. If you're late, at least directly explains it, but it doesn't determine it. It doesn't entail that the action happens.
Yeah. So you have C causes E, right? And then you have the fact that C causes E. Mm-hmm. So that fact grounds the fact that the action was free. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I'm not talking about the role played by C. I'm talking about the role played by the fact that C causes E.
Right, I see.
So do you think I still need something like an indeterministic notion of grounding in order to get that result? That's an interesting question that I hadn't thought about. So when C causes E, but that's only indeterministic.
Right. So
but it's a fact, right? It's a fact that C caused E.
Right.
It's a fact that the causal history is what it is. Yeah. So that can be a full ground in the strongest possible sense.
Right. I think One of the questions might be how much you build into the causal history. It seems like compatible with the causalist view, as I understand it, that you include in the causal history C indeterministically causes E, and you say only if C indeterministically causes E, only if that's the causal history, is the action free.
Yeah, I don't want to say that. I definitely don't want to say that. So okay. I think what I want to say is just that you need a causal connection of the relevant kind. How those causal connections obtain, whether they're the result of deterministic relations or indeterministic relations, is not really relevant. But you do need the relevant causal connection. So if I say that, I don't think I need anything like an indeterministic notion of ground.
Right.
Because the story is the same in both cases. But it's an interesting question. I'll have to think more about that question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the other question from the chat now, and then John Hawthorne will be after that. So this is Tibor's third question: how to resolve overdetermination that arises from presence of both top-down and bottom-up causes.
Does he have in mind like mental and physical?
I assume so, yeah, something like that.
So if that's what he's asking about, that's another place where I want to remain as neutral as I possibly can on the problem of mental causation. So some causalists, again, I think Mealy has suggested that, have said, you don't in fact need mental causation. You need perhaps the causal relevance of mental properties or something. You can appeal to the causal powers of the realizers, and that would still be consistent with the central causalist tenet. So I think I would be inclined to go with that if I can. It's an interesting question for causalism in general, not just for my view, obviously, whether we can say something like that. It would be better because it wouldn't commit us to any specific solution to the mental causation problem. So that's what I would like to say.
Okay.
But yeah, again, I thank him for the question. And I'm sorry if I misinterpreted what he was asking.
John Hawthorne is next.
Hi, Carolina, thanks for the talk. This is a slightly inchoate thing that concerns a point of detail that I think can be controlled for, but it struck me as interesting. It seemed to me that there were cases where you intend to phi that causes you to phi, and in fact you manifest a disposition to phi upon intending to phi, but you wouldn't want to say the phiing of interest is a thing you do intentionally. And in some of the cases, you might not even want to call it an action rather than a movement. So just as a warm-up, I mean, you might be adapted so that when you form, it might be adaptive when you form an intention to act, to sort of have enhanced involuntary eye movements, because you might pick up on danger. You know, if you're not intending to move, if you're not intending to move, there's sort of less need to sort of scan around, but you might involuntarily sort of have enhanced eye movements when you intend to move, and that might be a standing disposition. It's not exactly deviant, but as it were, that component of the thing isn't something that you're doing intentionally. Or suppose I'm, intending to elevate my heart rate by sort of injecting myself with a drug or something. It might be just in general, I'm built so that upon intending to do things, my heart rate elevates because that kind of facilitates the blood flowing and getting my muscles going. And so I may have a standing disposition to have an elevated heart rate upon forming an intention to do things, immediately do things. And in this case, I'm intending to cause my heart rate to go up. But the heart rate, as it were, the initial elevation isn't something that's even a behavior in this case. It's not something I'm doing intentionally, but it's not rightly classified either as deviant in the sense of this isn't what normally happens. It's completely normal as a piece of biology when I intend to move that so I think I'm just sort of thinking it's good to bear down on various conceptions of deviance in the vicinity here, and as it were, certain movements that may be normal upon forming intentions might nevertheless not be intuitively things that you're doing intentionally, and in some cases might not even be things you want to classify as behaviors. Or so I had a feeling there might be a little bit of need for tweaking or something of interest around there, but I don't know what you think.
Yeah, let me see. So I take it that the suggestion was that this could be a problem for causalism about action in general. I wonder if it is a problem for the enhanced version of the causalist view if you fine-grain the dispositions a little bit more, right? So the relevant disposition in the first kind of case that you described, I thought the idea was you form the intention to move, and that results both in your arm moving and in your eye moving in a certain way. And that part is not an intentional action. So if that's the kind of case, I think what you would have to do to deal with that is to be more fine-grained about either the behavior or the disposition involved. It's the disposition to move my arm when I intend to move my arm. It's not my disposition to move my eye when I intend to move my arm.
Just very quickly, I mean, we can get the same thing. I was thinking about things like that, and I'm sure there is some tweak, but you could keep the thing going a bit. I mean, it might well be when you intend to move your hand, you know, it might be people's hands, you know, they tense their muscles as a prelude to doing something, and that might be completely normal, and that involves hand movements. So it's not like, oh, the movement, the involuntary thing is in one limb or one part of your body, and then the locus of intentional action is always in a different part of your body. It's kind of easy to get the theme going,
Yeah.
where the locus is the same, but I'm not saying that means that the fine graining won't work. It's just, you can't control for the thing just by fine graining on the intended locus of the action, it seems to me. So.
Right, you would have to fine grain it in perhaps a slightly different way. So I intend to move my arm in this kind of way, right? As opposed to this kind of way when you start shaking or your muscles tense up or something like that.
I was thinking,
yeah,
one doesn't want to be too draconian. I mean, if you do that, and then there are surely cases we intend to move the arm in one kind of way and it ends up moving in another kind of way, maybe because you're not that good at moving your arm in that kind of way. And that's still an intentional movement. So just a failure to do it in quite the way you're intending. So it seems like there's a little bit of a challenge to not have the test be so draconian as to exclude things that you do want to count as intentional movements, but to not still filter out the sort of things that I'm talking about.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, it is a widely recognized problem among causalists that we don't want to be too specific about the plan of action, right? And what it's supposed to involve. So my plan might involve walking to school one day, but I might not be consciously taking the steps that are needed to walk to school, the specific steps that I'm taking, right? So yes, it is, I think, a pretty standard, widely recognized problem for causalism. If you have something like a planned view of intention, or if you have other views, they're gonna show up there, I take it, once you want to be a little bit more specific about the relevant behavior or the kind of connection that would have to obtain between the intention and the behavior, or about the content of the intention. There's different ways that the problem would arise, but it's definitely a problem. And I see why you say it's not the same thing as deviance, but it's connected to the deviance problem in the sense that you have to think about those two things at the same time, right? Because you don't want to give a solution to the problem of deviance that rules out our capacity to say that we can act intentionally, even when we're a little bit mistaken about how we're going to make it happen. So I'm tempted to think that they're connected issues, although you're right. I mean, it doesn't strike me as a standard deviance case, because I take it the main feature was it's normally correlated with this kind of behavior, right? Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's interesting.
Steph Collins.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is kind of a follow-up on some other questions, and I think it's just a request for clarification. So I was wondering about how freedom comes in degrees, and I was wondering how you would explain that. And I was thinking, or maybe you'd do it in terms of the range or number of powers that you have that don't manifest in the particular case. Or maybe you would do it in terms of the extent of those powers, if you think powers are the kind of thing that come in degree. So I was like, so I started to get a little bit worried because there seem to be lots of dimensions on which an action can be more or less free. So I was wondering what your answer to that is. And then this kind of came from one of the other questions. I became a little worried about kind of what the minimal threshold is. If we're accepting that actions can be more or less free, what the minimal threshold is for determining whether an action is free. And maybe you're going to say that varies from case to case. And then I started to get a bit worried about the theory's ability to give us judgments or predictions on new cases, if there's no kind of way of telling us exactly, you know, how many unmanifested powers do I have to have, and how strongly do I have to have those powers in order for the action to count as free. So can you just say something about degrees of freedom and the minimal cutoff point for an action being free, to try to firm some of that up?
I wish I had a full story to tell. In fact, I'm not convinced that there are degrees of freedom. That's a thing that one should say exists. There's different ways to tackle this issue, right? So either you could say there are no degrees of freedom, there are degrees of blameworthiness, perhaps. And degrees of blameworthiness can be accounted for in other ways. So for example, if you have a worse intention, then you're more blameworthy, right? If you're more certain that you're doing harm, then you're more blameworthy, and so on. And freedom could just be an on-off relation that, of course, is going to not be a completely black and white relation, in the sense that there's going to be borderline cases, right? So there's some compulsive agents who are not, you know, as compulsive as the story I was telling about the cookie monster, but they're still rather compulsive. What do we think about them? Are they free enough? What do our practices of blaming people and holding them accountable suggest about the connection between their freedom and their moral responsibility? I'm not sure what to say, but the fact that they're borderline cases, I don't think is a problem, because in some cases, we just don't know what to say about whether they're blameworthy or not. So I think that's a good feature of any such view. But yeah, so going back to the earlier point about degrees and the different dimensions, there's a literature on this now. And so people have recognized this in connection with freedom and in connection with reasons responsiveness in particular. So there's different considerations, there's different aspects that are intuitively relevant to how free you are when you act. And it's tricky to know how to weigh those dimensions against each other. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm not convinced that that's the best way of theorizing about all of this.
Okay, can I just a quick thought? So then, does the account, and is the account designed to give us judgments or predictions on new cases as to whether or not this agent is free? Because I worry that I'm a bit confused about the reflected equilibrium between judgments on particular cases and general theory, if the theory is
it's supposed to give us
fluid.
judgments about cases that are not actual. So I just made up the cookie monster agent. maybe it exists, maybe not. I have no idea if anybody's compulsively addicted to chocolate chip cookies, but there could be such an agent. So yes, of course, it's supposed to be a theory that has some predictive power, but it's also supposed to be a theory that deals with concepts that are not, that admit of some vagueness and uncertainty. And I think we should preserve that in our theories to the extent that we can. Thank you.
Daniel Cohen.
Thanks. So can I just first check, Carolina, whether I understand how you would want to deal with the Frankfurt cases? So these are cases where I'm going to do something, but had I not been able, had I not done it, some external force would have forced me to do it anyway. But as it happens, I just do it on my own anyway, so that without any external interference. So your theory is that when I act, part of the causal history of that action is I'm going to just talk in terms of dispositions, is a disposition which is sensitive to reasons in an appropriate way. So there are all sorts of reasons not to perform the action. So the action is maybe picking up this glass, and maybe I pick it up freely. Part of the causal history of that is that there's a disposition which is sensitive to reasons not to pick up the glass. So if that disposition figures in the causal history, then it's a free action. Now, this counterfactual intervener doesn't make it the case that I don't have that disposition. All that counterfactual intervener does is it masks the disposition. That's how some people put it. So would you kind of adopt that sort of masking account? So that I've got the disposition. The fact that some other thing would have prevented that disposition from manifesting under the right conditions doesn't make it the case that I don't act on this disposition in the actual sequence. Is that more or less the way you would want to deal with Frankfurt?
Good. So what I want to say is that the absences of reasons are still explanatory in a Frankfurt case. And I know that it's a little bit tricky to see that at first, because it's not true that, counterfactually, that had the reasons been present, then you would have ended up doing otherwise. So I think that's intuitively right. And I try to offer other examples, maybe that would help. Imagine that, again, I'll use the example of turning left at an intersection. And you're not, so you act intentionally, kind of automatically, but you act freely. You are a good driver. So you are subconsciously responding to the absence of obstacles along the way, the absence of a fire truck blocking the intersection, and so on and so forth, right? Now you add the intervener, the neuroscientist, into the picture. Does the mere addition of the neuroscientist, so the neuroscientist is there to make sure that you're going to turn left, regardless of what you try to do, right? Does the addition of the neuroscientist change anything as far as the causal history of your act? So I think it's kind of intuitive to say that it doesn't, that you're still responding to negative features of the circumstances, such as the fact that there is no fire truck blocking the intersection. The presence of the neuroscientist doesn't change that fact. So the unmanifested powers still play a role in grounding that causal explanation. So what I really want to say is that the claim that I really need is that the absences of reasons still causally explain your behavior in that case. And then perhaps if we go for the enriched version, that is grounded in the powers talk, right? Right. So in the Frankfurt case, I would say something similar. I would say the agent is really being reason sensitive. The actual causal history is in fact quite rich. The mere presence of the neuroscientist doesn't change that fact. And according to the enriched version, the unmanifested powers make it the case that that is so.
So there is an unusual Frankfurt case, though, which people kind of often overlook. This is in his other paper. So it's the case of the willing addict. So I don't think he makes it entirely clear, but I think it's got the same structure as the other Frankfurt cases. So just the only interesting difference with the willing addict is that the counterfactual intervener is actually part of the agent's psychology. So I'm addicted to tea, but I don't realize it. So every time but had I one day decide not to drink tea, my inner compulsion to drink tea would have kicked in and then forced me to drink the tea. But I'd blissfully go through life not realizing that I'm a tea addict. That's like his willing addict case.
So the willing addict case is the standard willing addict case is one where it's not a Frankfurt case. Is one where he's happy with being an addict. He's happy with responding to those kinds of reasons, right? So there's the relevant kind of match between the higher order and the lower order desires, right? So he wants to be moved by his addictive desire. And for him, that means that he's acting freely. So I would in fact reject that.
Okay, right.
Because he's not reason sensitive.
Yeah.
But you can imagine a Frankfurt case where you have something like a backup mechanism that is never in fact efficacious. It doesn't really have to be a neuroscientist.
Yeah, and it could be
so that would be a different. But
some people do say that the willing addict is a kind of Frankfurt case. It's that it's
Well, it was given by Frankfurt.
Yes, but it's. I suppose that doesn't matter. Yeah.
No, I think that's a confusion because on any reason sensitivity account that is plausible, we want to say that the willing addict is not acting freely. It's not responding to reasons. In fact, I have a story on the willing addict case in the Causation and Free Will book where I say, well, the most natural interpretation of that case is the higher order desires are not doing anything, right? They're a backup, if anything. They're not part of the actual causal history, but that's not how Frankfurt describes the case. He kind of tends to describe it as an overdetermination case, which is very confusing to me, if the higher order desire never intervenes in any way. So yeah, the whole story about the willing addict is, I think, kind of confused to begin with. But I don't deny that you might have the intuitions that Frankfurt had about that case. Those intuitions are coming from somewhere else. They're not coming from the same style of Frankfurt style reasoning, right? That says all that matters is what actually brings about your behavior. Because in the willing addict, he's free, according to Frankfurt, because of this hierarchical view that he has. Because there's a mesh between the higher order and the lower order desires, but the higher order desires are not part of the causal history at all. So that's in fact inconsistent with the other Frankfurt story. That's my take on the willing addict.
Thanks. I'll look up that section of your book. So,
thank you.
Nicholas Smith. You're muted.
Thanks.
There we go.
Yeah, look, I was just wondering, I mean, I suppose the deviant causation worry for the sort of non-enriched causalist view is that it kind of sets the bar for intentional action too low, that, you might have a reason to pee and you do as a result of that reason, but it's still not an intentional action. And so I guess the worry is that so then you add the requirement, well, furthermore, you have to have the disposition to do so, and it has to be, the disposition to do it, having intended to do it, and it has to be manifested. And so then the worry is that maybe this sets the bar a bit too high, because it's there's many sort of common cases where, or, at least not that far-fetched, where somebody might sort of get up every morning and intend to, go to the gym, or intend to eat healthily, or intend to do lots of things, and actually extremely rarely do it. So then they're not actually disposed to, do this act when they intend to do it, but sometimes they do. And it seems like on those occasions, it is an intentional action, even though they don't have a disposition to act that way when they intend to act that way.
Yeah, it's tricky, right, with dispositions. I mean, some people are pretty strict on the conditions that have to obtain for somebody to have a disposition, but other people are not. So I guess it would depend on that. Maybe I can't be completely neutral on dispositions or powers. I mean, would it change anything if we went for abilities instead of dispositions? It might be that what's going on there is that when you hear about somebody having a disposition, you have in mind something that is manifested quite regularly, right? Whereas with an ability, I mean, I have the ability to jump out, a window in a really tall building, but I am never going to exercise it, I hope. I have the ability to act on the intention. Do I have a disposition to act on that intention if I manage to form that intention? I'm not totally sure what to say. And as long as you can appeal to some dispositional concept or other, I think you could potentially make this work. But you see what I mean? Dispositions don't have to be surefire dispositions, right? A lot of people believe that.
Right.
I might have conflicting dispositions. Randy Clark has a paper on that. I forget his examples, something involving football. I tend to forget those examples immediately. American football. But you might be conflicted, right, in different kinds of ways. So you might have conflicting dispositions. So obviously, there's no expectation that you'll always be manifesting dispositions if it's quite easy to have dispositions.
Right.
I mean, what would you say about that? Would it be better for you to speak in terms of abilities? I just worry that, it's unclear what people mean by abilities, and somebody might think, oh, you have something more supernatural in mind, which is not at all what I want to do.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose you could still then tie it to, I mean, the nice thing about dispositions was the claim that then the deviant causal chain case is just like the case of the disposition. I suppose you could still do that if you were talking about abilities. It wouldn't really change it that much.
I mean, I formed an intention. I made up my mind. So if I really succeeded in doing that, is it really that crazy to think that I have some disposition to do it? Again, I might have conflicting dispositions. I might have a disposition that pulls against that. I might be very lazy. And that those two dispositions enter in conflict with each other might result in my not taking the necessary steps. I guess I would be fine with that story. That's another really interesting question to think about. The role of potentially conflicting dispositions in that problem. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thanks.
All right, well, I think that's all we have time for. So apologies to those whose questions we did not get to. But thank you, everyone, and thank you, Carolina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the great discussion. And if you want to get in touch, feel free to shoot me an email.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining us and presenting.